Welcome to JonGetsGames. Today I'll be reviewing nimmt. This game was designed by Wolfgang Kramer and Reinhard Staup, and it is a card game reminiscent to an older classic called nimmt. And much like that old game, this one is about simultaneously pulling one card out of your hand. It ranges from 1 to 100. You are trying to outthink your opponents such that when this card hits the table, it stays on the table and you don't have to take cards into your hand. There are a couple big twists to this game versus nimmt, and I'll explain how this game plays now, and then I'll jump into my review. In order to set up a game of nimmt, we first shuffle up this 100-card deck, and then we deal one card to the front of the 3 takes, 4 takes, and 5 takes cards in the middle of the table. Each player gets their own X takes cards, which they put in front of themselves, and lastly, 8 cards are dealt out to each player. Each card has a number on it that ranges from 1 to 100 with no duplicates, and they all also have these cow scoring symbols, and in this game you want to have the lowest score possible. At this point, all players simultaneously choose one card from their hand to put down in front of them, and I think we might go with something like the 95. Once they have all chosen, we will flip over all of these cards and then put them into these rows, but we start with the lowest number. So in this case, we have a 95, the left player has a 93, and the right player put a 55, so we'll start with this one. And you'll see it has a lot of these cow scoring symbols, so this is definitely a card you don't want to take. Now, you're going to put this in the row that has a number in the far right spot that most closely matches the current card number, but is always underneath it. So in this case, the 55 would go here because 52 is closer to 55 than 31 is. Next up, we have the 93, which would go next to the 90, and lastly, this 95 would go right here. And you'll see these 3 rows have different numbers on it. This is the 5 takes row, which means something happens when the 5th card goes down. For this one, it's the 4th card, and for this top row, it's the 3rd card. And in this case, we put this 95 down. And what this means is we actually take all of the cards that were in this row except for the card we actually played. So we have to take both of these cards and slide the 95 over. Whenever a player takes cards from the center, they have to choose one of them to go down into their X row, and the rest of the cards that they took will go back into their hands so they can play them out in future turns. At this point, the player has an interesting decision because when they put the cards down into the X row, they can keep adding them as long as they are ascending. But once they put a card down that is lower than the rest of the cards they have in this X row, then those cards will be taken into a scoring pile where they will be worth twice the amount of points on that card. And again, you don't want points in this game. The flip side is that if the round ends and you have cards in your X row, you will not score any points for those. So on the one hand, we might want to put the 90 down here and hope that we never have to take it as a scoring card so that we would not take these 3 points. But the opposite side is we could put this 93, not worry as much about taking these points, and then bring this back into our hand, or we could put it out into the field and hope that somebody else takes it and scores it. It's also important to note that if you ever try and put a card down that is lower than the rightmost card on all of the rows, then the player who chose this card will then choose one of these rows and take all the cards in it. So for instance, at this moment, they may take this 58 to put the 14 over here, or perhaps they will go down here and take the 13 and the 38 because they maybe like these cards better, because once again, they'll have to take one of these cards, put it down into their X row, and then the other card is going to go into their hand. At this point, we move into the next round where we once again select one card simultaneously, and it's interesting to note that both of our opponents now only have 7 cards in their hand, but we actually have 8 because we had to take those cards back into our hand. So as we're actually playing the game, the number of cards we have in our hand compared to our opponents is going to fluctuate, and the round will end once any player plays their last card down and they have no other cards in their hand and they would not have to bring any of their cards back up. At that point, we would then score. As I mentioned, you will get 0 points for any cards you have in your X row. Any cards that have to be taken out of your X row into a scoring pile will be worth double their points, and at the end of the round, everybody gets 1 point per cowhead symbol in the cards they still have in their hand. Once everybody has calculated their scores and written them down, we will then take all of the cards, do a complete reset, and play an entire another round, and then score up those points, and after that second round, the game will be over, and whoever has the lowest number of points wins. Let's now begin the review for nimmt by covering a few positive points. The first of these relates to a really great twist that nimmt has versus nimmt, its predecessor, specifically with where the cards go when you grab them after busting on a row. So in nimmt, whenever you do that and you grab those cards, they just go into a face-down score pile, and you don't want points at the end of the game, and that's kind of that. But in XNIMT, you have this great new twist where the cards you pull up, one of them is going to go down into the X row, and that's all I'm going to say about the X row for the moment because I'm going to get to that soon. But specifically, all the rest of those cards, they come back into your hand. And this might not seem like a huge difference versus those games, like one's a score pile, one's your hand, but this has probably the largest changes to the overall gameplay of XNIMT versus its predecessors, because you now get to kind of customize your hand to a certain extent as the round goes on. In the previous games, once you play a card, it's just out there and you maybe get points or maybe you don't, and it's just done. Like, the ramifications of that decision are over. Also, in the previous game, you pretty much never want to take cards from the center of the area. But now that you have XNIFT with this new little tweak of pulling these cards back into your hand, you will find yourselves at times intentionally playing a card such that you want to take cards from the middle of the row, because you'll be able to get those back into your hand and you'll be better suited to deal with the other rows that are currently out. Like, maybe you'll do that so then you grab some low cards so that you can go over to this one area, or high cards so that you can go over here, because in 6th it's all about planning your 10 cards as they dwindle down to nothing, such that you are flexible enough and also trying to just dodge the points as much as you can. But in XNIMT, you have this constant dynamic hand where you are just trying to play, obviously, where the board, like, you still don't want points. In general, you're trying to avoid them. But I like that sometimes you do want to take cards into your hand, and the extra decisions that this adds to the overall gameplay is a lot larger than I originally thought it would be. For positive number 2, let's now discuss that X row that goes in front of you. So versus other nimmt style games, every single player has their own customized ascending order row of cards. And this is also a pretty cool tweak on the overall game system, because the cards that are in your X row score you 0 points at the end of the round. And in other nimmt style games, whenever you take cards, all of those are going to be worth points to you. So here, the cards that go in your hand are obviously worth points, so you want to try and get rid of those, but the ones in the X row are worth nothing, and so you're constantly planning out how you can potentially intentionally grab some cards from the middle of the row, like I just talked about, so that you are building your X row as tightly and probably starting as low as possible as you can, because you really don't want to break that X row, because all those cards now get become double points. They actually go into a face down score pile, and that's where things can get pretty dicey. So you have this ability to somewhat inoculate some of the really terrible cards in the deck that might give you like 5 or 7 points. If you get them into that X row, it's fine as long as you don't bust. And this X row adds such a cool new sense of tension to the game, as you are seeing how the main rows in the middle of the table are playing out, but also seeing your own X row kind of getting bigger and bigger. And there have been several times where near the end of the round, it is just like, it could go either way. It's just like on a razor, if I'm going to have to dump this whole X row into my hand and take like 15 points, or not and take like 0 points. And that is a very big difference in points overall. That really could win you the game or not, because you only play 2 rounds to the game. And I just love the extra tension that it brings. So just great decisions of, just great added decisions of what cards you want to take from the middle and how they're going to play out with the X row, the tension and everything. It's just a really cool new thing to the game. First I thought it might be a bit of a gimmick, but now I'm totally sold on it. And now for positive number 3, I want to mention one other great ramification of pulling cards back into your hand versus putting them into a score pile, and that is that you're going to have a variable number of turns in each given round. And I should briefly kind of apologize that it seems like all these positive points are just comparing and contrasting XNIMT to 6NIMT, but I do believe all 3 of these points would stand alone as positive points in general, just strong aspects to the game. They just happen to also be tweaks off of 6NIMT. And I just really like how this changes the overall tempo of each given round, because in 6NIMT, you have those 10 cards and you just keep on playing, and then on the last round, everybody plays their last card and it's over. But in XNIMT, you might have a situation where you have 6 cards in your hand and your opponent has 1 or 2, and you are going to change how you play because of that. You need to think about the number of cards that your opponents have, and think about, maybe, do you remember what they might have in their hand? Is it likely that they're about to bust and get 5 more cards or 4 more cards back into their hand so the round keeps going? Or maybe they'll just play 1 or 2 cards and the round ends and you have all these cards in your hand that are all worth negative points to you, or I guess points in general, because points are bad. So there is quite a bit of extra things to think about, and a neat kind of evolving tension as the round goes on. when somebody pulls a bunch of cards back into your hand, you might, on one hand, be happy because it means they're probably going to take points for that. But on the other hand, you're maybe happy because it means the round's going to keep going. You're like, I really want them to bust, not necessarily because they get points, but because I really want to get the stuff out of my hand. And maybe they're really close to it, and that's going to incentivize you to actually play like a 5 or 7 point card that's just really bad if it's in your hand. Take a little bit of a risk to try and get it out there so that it's not actually in your hand at the potential end of the round, because you just never know. Even if two people have one card in their hand, they could potentially both bust, and the round keeps going. And I just like that tweak. Let's now move into my neutral point sections. I only have one to cover, and this has to do with how memory is a bit of a mechanic in this game. Now, you never had memory in older like nimmt games, like 6nimmt, for instance. You could maybe hope that people don't have stuff in their hand, but you have no knowledge of what they maybe pulled back in. And in xnimmt, you can definitely play around the knowledge of what they have in their hand, and if you are particularly good at remembering these kind of things, I do think you are going to have a bit of a leg up, because there will be situations where people have very low amounts of cards and you saw them take cards before, and maybe you remember, oh, there should be a 5 and I don't have the 5. The 5 hasn't come out yet. Maybe they'll do that right now. And of course, there's so many cards in this game, and they shift all over the place to the point where only somebody who is particularly gifted at memory is going to wield this very well. But especially at lower player counts, like at the 2-player game, I found that I was able to remember enough stuff to play around that with my opponent. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I just know that memory mechanics can sometimes turn other people off, and they can definitely turn me off to a certain extent. But as I mentioned, that only seemed to kind of crop up at the 2-player mark, and it was not a huge big deal. It's just something you should know going in. Let's now move into my negative points section. I only have one I want to mention, and it's not actually a critique of any of the mechanics in the game. It's more a critique of the scope of the game, and that is that I'm perhaps spoiled by 6nimmt that plays up to 10 players, but I was pretty bummed to find out that xnimmt only plays 2 to 4 players. Now, I get that there are these extra layers that they have put into the game of xnimmt, such that the chaos of like 8, 9, and 10-player games would be way too much, but I feel like even on the lower end, it probably would have been impossible to get a good 6-player version of this going like right out of the box, to the point where I kind of want to play around with maybe house rules to it. I haven't had the opportunity to play a 5-player game yet, but I think when I do, if I do, but I hope to, I will change it so that the rows take at 4, 5, and 6 as opposed to 3, 4, and 5. Obviously, I don't have a 6 card to make to work in the middle, but I'm sure we could figure something out. And so yeah, I think this game is so much fun. It's all simultaneous with the selection of the cards, so having a really big player count does not necessarily tank the overall playtime of the game. I'd like to share this with more players. I mean, realistically, I would love to see this game go 2 to 6 players. I would never really dream that it would go more than that with all the extra mechanics on there, but it doesn't, so maybe that's just going to be left to people like me who really like the game in general and would pretty much always want to play xnimmt over 6nimmt, and if we have 6 players, I'm going to want to try to make that happen for xnimmt versus 6nimmt, because there's so many extra cool decisions in the box. I just want to make sure that it isn't broken when I do it. Let's now discuss the variability for xnimmt, and to me, for the style and weight of game that this is, I think that it is pretty average. I would not go into something like this expecting asymmetric player powers or like variable endgame scoring setups or anything like that. This is, at the end of the day, a small box with a bunch of cards in them that range from 1 to 100 with some negative point tokens on them, and that's kind of it. There's lots to think about, and I enjoy the challenge of trying to figure out how to play my hand, but every time you sit down to play the game, you're sitting down to play the exact same game. But I think that most people expect that when they see a card game of this style, and I do enjoy figuring out the new puzzle that each hand gives me based on the cards I have and the cards that are on the table and how I might want to pull those cards into my hand so that I have new and different options. So all these things come together to, I think, be an average amount of variability for a card style game. As I mentioned before in the negatives, xnimmt plays 2 to 4 players, and I've played all 3 of those player counts, and I'm happy to say that they all work well, but I do think this game is best at 4, because you have just that extra amount of chaos that comes from people flipping over their cards and trying to play off of what everybody's going to do, and also having 4 new cards added to the rows in the middle is going to have a much more dynamic feeling than the 2-player game, where only 2 cards are added to the middle, and you will somewhat often have situations where both cards go in and nobody takes, versus a 4-player game, you pretty much have 1 to 2 players taking cards back into their hand almost every single round, and so playing around that can be really quite interesting. I will state that because the rounds end when one person runs out of all cards in their hand, that does mean that the game goes quite a bit longer with the 4-player game, because you still do 2 full rounds at all of these player counts, and it just takes longer to get rid of all the cards in your hand when it's so chaotic and you continue to bring things back into your hand. But I did not feel like the 4-player game I played overstayed its welcome. I think it probably came in at about 45 minutes, maybe a little longer than that, but I was enjoying myself so much that I didn't really look at the clock to know exactly. So, as I mentioned in the negative, I do wish this game played more players, because I think the style of game is better with the more people you add in. But I did enjoy the 2-player game. It felt like a lot more strategic. As I mentioned before, there's a bit of a memory game going on here where I tried to remember what my opponent pulled back into their hand and put down, because there's only one opponent, so that's something that you could feasibly do. I will say the 2-player game I did, we ended up playing 3 full rounds instead of 2, because it seemed like it was a more satisfying experience doing 3 rounds of full play with the 2 players than not. So if you play the 2-player, maybe give that a shot. But in general, they all worked. In conclusion, I've played XNimmt 3 times at this point, although I have played 6nimmt probably 20 or more times in the past. So I'm somewhat experienced with the overall system, and I can say that I love the stuff that XNimmt has brought to the nimmt style system, and at this point, I pretty much always want to play XNimmt versus any of the others because of these extra great decisions that you have to play with. You are pulling cards back into your hand, so you're kind of cultivating the cards you have in your hand. You're working with this X row that you have in front of you, and that's going to definitely affect how you're actually playing the cards down into the middle, so that you can try to have the smallest gaps as possible. And occasionally you'll really mess it up and you'll start with like an 80, and that is going to have probably bad ramifications for you for the rest of the round. But it's just one more piece to this great puzzle that you're constantly thinking about with the cards that you have in your hand. And versus other nimmt style games, your hand just constantly gets replenished as you're going through the round. So it's not even just a de-escalation of options as you get smaller and smaller. You're just ebbing and flowing, and the tension is also ebbing and flowing as I'm playing it. I just love playing this game, especially at the higher player counts, because it is fully simultaneous. So that means that most of the decision making is happening all at the same time. So analysis paralysis or downtime or any of those things have not cropped up much in the plays that I've had. The only real critique I have of the game is that it officially only supports up to 4 players, and I would love to see it support 5 or 6. But as I mentioned before, I might just try to house rule something if I find myself in a situation where I do have 5 or 6 players and we all want to give this a shot. So this is not a game that's going to be hitting the table every single week for me. I do really enjoy the additions it has over the nimmt style system, but in general, I don't actually play simpler card games like this one that much. But I will say that this one, for the moment, is right at the top of the priority list for me to bring out in those good situations. It's a really thinky game, and it does not even play that long. As far as the overall length, it's usually between 30 and 40 minutes, which means you can easily start or end a game night with this, or even stick it right in the middle while other people are trying to finish out a game. There's just a lot of fun, puzzly decisions here, and I really recommend it. As always, I'd like to thank everyone who has been supporting this channel through Patreon, including all of these producer level pledges. If you too would like to directly support everything that I do here, you could do so at patreon.com/JonGetsGames, and I'd really appreciate it. Also, if you'd like to see more in-depth board game reviews like this one, as well as full game playthroughs and vlogs, please subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.